Welcome back to another episode of Slates and Koffee. We are your hosts, Toy, Nneka, and Tequoia. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so glad that you all can come back and take a sip with us as we talk about the topic today on white privilege. Does it exist? Does it not exist? Why does it exist? Well, in this industry, it pretty much does exist because it's a white dominated industry, and it exists in other industries, but this one in particular. So we are going to bring on our guests. We're not going to wait any further. Knajula Edwards, welcome in.
Come on down.
He's on down. He's on down the road.
Hello, hello.
Hey.
Welcome.
Love the fit. Love the fit.
Well, thank you. How are you, ladies?
We
Well,
are
and you.
Good.
We are
Good.
well.
We are getting filled by all these conversations today.
I love it. On a Sunday.
On a Sunday.
On a Sunday. Knajula, you want to explain to us about what you do in this industry?
Yes. First and foremost, thank you so much for having me on. I accept it as a privilege and an honor to be able to share with you ladies this afternoon, not only to give, but also to glean. Like, being amongst other Black women who are in the industry, I always take it as very, very special because there's so many things that you can get, excuse me. But so to your question, I am a creative, of course, in the entertainment industry, actress, writer, producer. I love to create projects with, I think every creator wants to be able to share their story through their lens, through their experiences. And so for me, it's all about how can you get that story out there? You're the only person that's experienced it. And so in my mind, the world has to hear your perspective.
Absolutely. So since the topic today is white privilege, what is your definition of white privilege?
That is an interesting question because I think it's such a loaded question, first and foremost. Yeah. I feel like white privilege, it's one of those things where, we're all, let's be honest, we all come from the same kind of history in terms of certain things that people have experienced and some people have not, but I think white privilege is more of an unspoken, almost like an unspoken behavior, an unspoken characteristic of a certain type of people. And the interesting thing is, and I'll be very transparent with you, the interesting thing is a lot of times we take it as to be almost from like a negative connotation, but it's not always so. I have friends that are in all different kinds of races, right? And I think sometimes it's one of those things where some white people don't even know they're operating in it, right? So I don't necessarily always take the approach that it's a negative thing, but in short, to answer your question, white privilege, I believe is something that is kind of like an unspoken trait, unspoken characteristic or behavior that is exemplified by the white race, if you would.
Why don't you think that some white people don't even know what white privilege is or think they're living it?
Well, so for instance, I have, again, tons of white friends. Whether they consciously realize it or not is what I'm saying is it could be the way in which they, I guess my thought is when someone is experiencing white privilege, if they are just used to that's how they've been raised, how they act, how they maybe respond to certain things, it's not like, I don't think it's a conscious effort, well, let me respond this way because I have white privilege or I can exemplify. I think it's just that if you're used to being raised a certain way or acting a certain way, that's just how you respond. Like, you don't even stop to think. And again, may not be the case for all people, but you're not stopping to think like, oh, this is white privilege. I'm going to exercise it at its finest. So that's why I mean that I don't think that everyone makes a conscious decision to act or to use that, if you would. That's just my personal thought.
And I'd just like to add on real quick, because I do like the fact that you're specifying that it's not always a conscious decision. And I think this is where I would throw in certain other terms, not like all the time, but just in this conversation. I know a lot of times white privilege gets mixed up with racism as well, or racist, right?
Exactly.
I look at all those words: racism, racist, white privilege, white supremacy, and prejudice, and they each have their own definition for a reason. Like Absolutely. You just said right now, white privilege isn't always an overt thing. It's not necessarily something that's intentionally. It's literally a consequence of a system that was set up for the white demographic, and even more so the white male demographic.
Right.
And so in the end, we live in a society, at least in America, in a society that, as we already know, is geared towards the white person. Yes, even right now, we have a bit more pushback now and a bit more changing now, but obviously we're speaking more to the generation we grew up with, because that's what we were complaining about for good reason. So white privilege at the end of the day is something that is just a byproduct. And so when you hear a lot of people, a lot of white people to be specific, try to fight against it, be like, well, what are you talking about? I'm white and my house was foreclosed and I still had issues with the bank. And it's like, no, I completely understand, completely hear you. But at the end of the day, it's a bigger situation than that. We're not talking on an individual level. It's the byproduct. It's the system that we have set up in this country that, because you are of a white lineage, whether that be European, well, at all times it's going to be European. It's not like they just raised from the ground, the American ground, white people. But, you know, based on the fact that you can easily be identified as white and your family is, there are certain things set in place. You know, like you were saying earlier, there are things that they just know it's part of their culture. And one way that I've seen it unfold is financial literacy, right? So I consider that a bit of a privilege, that they had in this country more space and education in that realm than other groups have. So they'll see that affect their life choices, and that is a privilege. And then there's the modern privilege where, because they're white, they can get into certain spaces. And so it's not something they're choosing to do. And so because they're thinking of it in terms of racism, in terms of prejudice, they're grouping it in as something negative that you don't want to be. And it's like, it's more than that. At all times, a lot of the issues we face in this country are intersectional, and they each have their own specific definition. And sorry, I think I'm going off on a tangent here. I'll stop in a second. But yeah, that's how I view it. And that's why when you said conscious decision, I think that's something key that I think people should utilize more often and stop using it as a word to use against someone or throw on them. When I get upset about, so sorry, it keeps like backing up when you talk. So that's why I keep stopping. Oh. No, you're fine to talk. It's just my phone is being so weird right now. But if I look weird, like stopping and starting, that's why my phone is like glitching. But yeah, that's why whenever I have an issue or want to address a certain issue, I like to be very specific. What you're doing is prejudice. And here's why it ties into racism. Racism is systematic. You are either, you know, and then I usually use the word specifically so people don't try to interchange these things and we derail the solution because people are tied up with not wanting to be seen as one thing or the other when they kind of all have their own avenues.
Agreed. And if I could piggyback off something you said, I think a lot of times we use these words to weaponize. And let me just be very clear. While we can all acknowledge that white privilege, white racism, all these things exist, personally, my personal experience, and I know people might be like, when I say this, I've never personally, to my face, blatantly, right, experienced racism. Now, has it happened out behind me when the clothes? Probably so, right? I'm not oblivious to say that it does not happen. I grew up in a very small town. A lot of my friends were white. I have white friends, Black friends, Asian friends, neither here nor there. My thing is, my first filter or the lens that I look through things is not racism, white privilege. It's not any of those things. Now, to say it doesn't exist, that's completely absurd. But what I will say is, personally, that's not what I lead with. And I think a lot of times when we talk about white privilege and prejudice and racism, it's always given. I'm not saying that it's always, I think a lot of times it's used to weaponize. Like, instead of talking about, like, we could talk about white privilege. I'm not talking about for the show. I'm just talking about in general, right? We could talk about white privilege all day. But at the end of the day, talking about it, what are we solving? What are we doing about it? If there's anything to do about, other than it being another topic of conversation. Yeah, we know it exists. And what can we do about it? You know what I mean? So so thank you for that point. But yeah, I think a lot of times the word is used to kind of like weaponize. And I just always choose to look at things, try to take the lighter approach, if you would. But that doesn't mean that things don't exist. I'm not oblivious to say that, so.
The approach of like, this is a situation, this is how I'm going to overcome it and thrive within it. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Well, I think we need to start by the people who benefit from the system needs to acknowledge that they are beneficiaries of the system, and then they're the ones that have to make that change. They're the ones that have to implement the change, because we can't do it. We're not benefiting from the system. So I would say, like, for an example, um, a writer who is mediocre and they're a white male and they get hired for a show to write on a show, and let's say they continue to get selected and hired to write on multiple shows, they're now they benefited from the system, and now they're in a position where they can potentially help other people. So instead of continuing to benefit from the system, they're now in the position where they could pass on a job to someone else who does not benefit from it. And I think that's where we should challenge the people who are in these positions of power who do benefit from white privilege to say, yes, acknowledge that. And then now what can you do? Instead of me just sitting back and say, okay, well, it is how it is. I want those people to then take away some of their benefits to help other people who don't have that. Of course, like I said in the last interview, that's asking a lot, because that's expecting someone who is in a position of power to then release some of their power to give some of that away. And we all know that that's very unlikely to happen, because it's not very often that you meet a white man in authority that's going to say, hey, let me pass on a job to someone else instead of me taking that job. But it would be nice. That's wishful thinking, hopefully.
Yeah, here's the thing with that is it's not well, let me not say what it's not. I think that happens with all races and all cultures, right? Not to take it away from obviously the topic of the show, but I think there's a lot of times that people are in position of power, if you would, right? Where they do have the ability to maybe step aside or relinquish some of the control. I mean, let's be real. Let's talk about it within our own culture. We have a scarcity mentality. We get to the top. Some people don't want to open the doors to let the next Black woman in, to let the next turn in, right? So so when like I said earlier, for me, my approach is always very rounded in terms of, not only is it happening in white culture, it's happening in the Black culture, the Asian culture, the Latin culture. It's to me, it's not so much about a race thing than it is about a human thing, right? Because we all have a lot of the same tendencies. Racism aside, let's put that aside. We all have a lot of the same tendencies, like me. It's all about me, and the power that I can attain and where I can go. But instead of talking about from a human perspective, hey, how can I reach back and pull up the next person behind me? And I think we would be remiss not to make that point, that it's not just a white thing, it's not just a Black thing, it is a human thing for us. And here's the other thing to that. It's like, that's one person. It takes one, but it's going to take a multitude of people to be able to have that, to shift that mindset and have that perspective. And I think that, where, yes, it starts with maybe a collective of people coming together, like, hey, how can we change the narrative? It's going to take God, baby. Let's be real. It's going to take God to be able to, but you can start with one person, because if you take that perspective, right? Toy takes that perspective. It starts with one, and then gathering those people, and then that's what you call when you have a movement, right? But it has to start with one person. But I think it's a human thing. It's not a white thing. It's a human thing.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I definitely believe it's a human thing. And I think when we talk about white privilege, it's because they are the majority. They're the majority everywhere in the U.S. They're the majority in the U.S. They're majority in some of these industries, these powerful money-making industries. But yes, it is a human thing, because if there's a Caucasian in a certain position, it's not about, oh, I'm gonna bring the next Black person up. Who cares about if it's Black? It's brown, it's tan, it's red, it's green, whomever you think that is more qualified, because they're in the industry, there are a lot of unqualified people in high positions versus the ones that actually go to school. I mean, Chadwick's story, Bozeman, was a very beautiful story on how hard he worked. He went to college, he did theater, but he kept getting looked over. And, I don't know about his circle, but he kept pushing. But it seems that the minority in the industry have to work way harder than of white ethnicity.
Oh, no, you go ahead. You go ahead.
No, we are interviewing you. I'll be right after.
No, and I totally understand what you're saying, and I don't take away from that. Very, very well may be the truth for a good amount of people. Here's my personal perspective. First and foremost, God is the head of my life. First and foremost. So
Amen.
I'm very much one of those ones, and my friends can tell you, I'm very much one of those ones when I'm met with what I call physical opposition, right? It's never about the physical. It's always about the spiritual. So I personally always choose to be like, listen, what's for me is for me. Can't no white man, white woman, Asian man, Asian, Black, can't nobody take what's mine. And so, yes, while it may seem that, and while the numbers may definitely support that, I still believe that whatever is supposed to be for us will be for us. Do we have to maybe sometimes go about it a little bit untraditionally? Yeah. I mean, look, our history is what our history is. We can't take away from that. But what I'm saying is I just choose not to play into, oh, well, the white man and boo, 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 boo. That's not always the case. And where it may be, I don't let that stop me. I don't let that get in the way. You know what I mean? Because it's, again, for me, it's not about, oh, this white man is holding the power. Absolutely not. My God said I can have whatever I ask if I ask in his son's name. And not to go all spiritual and biblical, but I just, when I'm met with stuff like that, like I choose not to feed into that narrative of the white man holds the power. The majority of the power is held by the white man, this, that, and the third. Very well could be what that looks like on the outside, but my God says different. You know what I mean? And so that's that. So I understand, and again, that does not negate or take away from the fact of maybe like a Chadwick Boseman story or anybody's story. I just personally choose to believe like, okay, that's what you say, but my God gonna do something different.
So
And I was also
go ahead. Go ahead.
Two things actually. One, to speak to what you just said, Knajula. Don't let me forget it. It's slipping. Okay, I might have to come back to it. It literally just left me right now. Yeah, it left me. I'm sorry. But to go further back with this, I think, again, with a lot of the issues we face in this world, but even more specifically this country, everything has so many different elements to it. So like you're saying right now, like all of us are saying right now, addressing whether or not this is something we need to address head on, or is this something we have to find other avenues? I think it's a mixture of everything. I think there's definitely an acknowledgement that has to be had. Like you were saying, Knajula, this is not so much a white person thing, it's a human condition. I remembered what I was gonna say. So you were talking about how the spiritual aspect of it, if God has something for you, it's for you. I agree. And I also will say that, and it went away again. That is so wild. Does God not want me to say this? Okay, if it happens a third time, I'm just dropping it. If it happens a third time, I'm dropping it. But let me go back to the other point then. So I'll just write it down next time, because this is wild. This is weird. I don't forget that easily. But so when it comes to addressing this issue, I remembered it and I'm remembering it. I'm not letting it go. Back to the spirituality aspect. It is not flesh and blood. It is principalities of the air. I understand, though, not everyone believes in Christ, to each their own. But for those who are Christian and believe in that, I always remember that as well. Like I can sit down and be like, that's that person. And in a sense it is, that's a choice they made. It's not like God made robots. We have the agency to make our decisions to do good, do bad, and everything in between. But ultimately it's not so much this person, that person, it's God versus the devil and his people, which might sound hocus pocus to other people. I respect that. This is what I believe. I know it's beyond us in this material world. There's spiritual forces at play, and he knows how he's doing his stuff. I don't know the specifics to it because I'm not in that realm, but that was the other point I was going to make. But, you know, even still, we are in this material world and we have to deal with this material world, right? So like I was saying earlier, it is a bit of a combination. Me personally, I'm kind of like you, Knajula, where I'm not focusing on this is what the white man did, I'm going to go get him, blah, blah, blah. But there is a sort of acknowledgement that has to be had if there is to be a sort of resolution across the board. You know, awareness and education is what I call it. I know they're trying to implement critical race theory. I don't know where that is. I'm not really plugged into the education situation right now, but I know that's something that people are at least pushing for, so that from the get-go, from elementary school, people are kind of growing up understanding race relations in our country. Why? So that as they grow, they can make better decisions and not so much have to worry about the civil legislative aspects of it. And Tequoia, before you were saying how, at least in the workforce, white privilege is an issue and therefore they need to understand. I understand people thinking that, but for me, I just don't see it that way. I don't need someone else to understand. They're messing up. I hate that. And I would love for them to know it. But you know what? I believe that I have enough power and energy to get this done myself. I know it's not that easy. And I know I'm definitely speaking from privilege here because people in the slavery era might not have the same outcome. Their stakes were much different, you know, but at least in the world that I live in now, and in the society I live in now, I stick to the fact that it would be so much easier if they understand. And I do agree. I agree with programs like affirmative action. I agree with it. This is not me saying we don't need them. We're going to make our own way. I agree with it because I do feel like there is the practical end of it at the end of the day. You know, that came into play in a time period where they really were gatekeeping to the T. So you had to have government officials literally step in to say, we have to, you know, civilly make this make sense for everyone. And so it made sense. So maybe there's two levels of it. You know, you have the individual level, how you are going to respond to it in your life. And then there's a higher level where it affects your livelihood, your workforce, you know, institution. I feel like you can't force people to be about a situation. And like we said earlier, power is power. People are not just, at best, they might try to tweak it so as to keep the masses pleased. But at the end of the day, they're trying to keep that power. And I don't like that they have that power, but I have agency to not give them my power. And it ties into, again, another solution that we've talked about multiple times, turning to the people who are like-minded and become an insurance amongst yourself. And we might consider that a grand scale answer. It might not even look like that. It might just be your small community. And unfortunately, your small community operating within this unfortunately, what's that word? Corrupted system that we're in. But again, that's just one answer, one viewpoint towards it. I just don't feel like this push to, I mean, there is a push that should happen where we should fight for making sure people are aware and educated. And then on a civil level, we should make sure we have laws that fight for equity, but there's going to be an individual social level where people just kind of have to get there on their own. And if they don't, we need to figure out what we're doing on our end, because you can't force people to make that jump, which you already said that as well. You said that, you know, they're not just going to give up power. They're probably not going to just be forced into that.
Yeah.
I think it's accountability.
Yeah.
Yes, you can, you know, don't really focus on the power that be in your office or your setting. But what we're doing now is raising awareness that it does exist and that it does happen. And the principalities is there. Yes, we can pray on it, but at some point, like what we're doing physically is building awareness to let it know that I see you. Okay. I can't really do anything about it. I can go the Tyler Perry route and built my own dang on Hollywood and Atlanta shows. And that's that. And sometimes, you know, like any closed doors, if you keep closing because of the power that be, then sometimes our God is pushing you somewhere else to build something greater for your Black community or for your community, period. There's Hispanics that don't have that Tyler Perry representative, so you guys come over here. So, you know, we can look at it as bad, but at the same time, we should look at it as good too, because like in ancient days, they built their own tribes, their own empires. They didn't really ask or beg or borrow from the other ones. When they didn't give it to you, you go and make your own.
Absolutely. And to your point, I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't have to ask permission for anybody to do anything, right? Like, okay, yeah, that might be the CEO of that company, but like you said, if I want to do it, we live in an era now, it's like, we don't, you know, as an actor, like used to back in the day, it's like, oh, you want a part, go see if there's a part for you, go audition, and then let your future be held in someone else's hands. No, we live in the world that, hey, if you want that part, you go write it, you go produce it, you go direct it yourself, and now you have your part because you created it. You didn't ask permission. And I think that's the thing that we forget a lot of times is God gives us free will, right? Yes, we need to seek him and all that great stuff, but he gives us free will. We are not without our own power. And I think a lot of times like you said, you're right. Yes, we acknowledge it. We know it exists. We be absurd not to say that it doesn't exist, right? But in that same breath, knowing that it exists, knowing that it takes more than just me and making people aware. In the meantime, I think as it comes to me, in the meantime, it's like, okay, on one hand, I know this exists and I know that this is a culture here. So while I'm not one man unto my own island, so to speak, then while that's happening, let me get over here and start doing the things that I know that are within my power to create and control and have a different narrative so that I can experience a lot of the same things that maybe my white counterparts experience. The reality of it is we can't change history. That privilege, so to speak, is what it is, right? I can't go back and erase 400 years or even prior to that of culture and history within that particular community. But what I can do is I can go out and control and create my own narrative and not be hung up over on what's happening over here. But let me take power into my own hands. Let me get that. Let me operate in that free will that God has given me. And so I appreciate your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I brought that up is because ignorance breeds ignorance. And if you don't know, then that can be a dangerous thing because it can build into a powerful engine of ignorance and hate. And we've seen how ignorance and hate can affect establishments that we've created in our own communities to empower us. Black Wall Street. That was, we had many, many versions of Black Wall Streets throughout the United States. And those powers that were in authority at the time dismantled it, destroyed them. So they need to not only acknowledge the power that they have, the privilege that they have, but they need to act in a way that's going to serve the community as a whole and not just themselves, because that's feeding more into their power, which it can become corrupted. So I agree with everything that all of you have stated, where we need to acknowledge that, but then don't rely on that for our bread and butter to go and create our own. But there's that side that if they don't work on their issues based on the knowledge of the privilege that they have, that could be bad for us because they can take that power and try to destroy what we're creating on our own. So that's why I stated that they have work to do, because
so sorry.
No, go ahead.
I actually wanted to propose something because I feel like sometimes people are just giving too much credit. You're not the only one to say this. I hear people say this all the time. They need to know, they need to understand. I'm sitting here like, I know damn well they understand. You cannot tell me that these
don't.
people.
A
No,
lot
I
of
feel
them
like there's
don't.
an aspect. I feel like there's an aspect of it they truly don't understand because they haven't experienced it. But I think they understand it on a grand level. And so their opposition is because for most of them, not everyone, I think most of it, the opposition is, I just don't want it to change. I just don't care enough to want to know. And so if that's where it's stemming from, saying, I need them to understand isn't going to do much, even if you get them in the classroom. Hopefully they have that one class one day where it clicks and they realize and they grow empathy or something. But ultimately, if someone's heart is not in the right place, it's not necessarily going to be changed. I do agree though, on everything you just said. I just feel like, in fact, we're talking about the glass shattering boys club thing. My thing was like, I think they're well aware of the situation and the system that they've created. And on some fronts, they make it seem like they try to give some rationale as to why they do things the way they do, or the way things have to stay, or blah, blah, blah. But I'm sitting here and I'm going to give you more credit and believe that you know full well what you're doing. You're just packing on the power you have and keeping it in place for a reason, claiming ignorance. But I feel like you're well aware. You might not know it on a intrinsic level because you have not experienced it, but you know enough about it to know it's something that that really should change. Either that, or you're just, in my opinion, delusional to believe that things are great the way they are for all people, which it's not. And that's where I think civil law comes in, because before they had all the power to just do as they were. And so they just kind of got away with whatever, whether or not they tried to rationalize it or not. But we're kind of, not just now, we've been in this place for a while where we get to propose new legislation so as to level the playing ground. But we need to push more on that because there's a lot of pushback for obvious reason. But I don't like to give them benefit of I feel like they're fully aware of the fact that things need to change. Anyone pushing back, I feel, is just someone who just doesn't want it to change. Although I wish they would.
I have a quick example. My husband, right? I tell him we live in an all white community in Georgia, in the South, the dirty. And when we're out and about, I explained to him that it's different from, this world is different from what you get from the white community versus a Black woman, right? It's crazy to say that because he's a Black male. And he's like, no. And I'm like, no, really? Like, if we're going into the store, I get certain looks as a brown-skinned female and you get none. They look at you and they smile. But I get, and he's like, no, they don't do that. I'm like, no, really, they do. I don't know what it is, but it's not even, it's just, I think it's just the world that we live in. And he doesn't understand it because he doesn't live it. He doesn't experience it. And we can say the same thing for some Caucasians. They don't know. Some of them don't know because they don't experience it. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what are you talking about? Right? So it's just some people that haven't walked that line, walked in those shoes. Some do know and they're playing, crazy. But there's some that actually don't know.
But I would say, even in that example you gave, that was a specified thing. I'm pretty sure if you ask your husband, would you agree that Black women in general are, have a different experience than Black men? I can't speak for him and you know him, but I would think he would be aware of that. Mm-hmm. That's more so what I was talking to, like in the general sense, they are aware. And if they can't even agree on that aspect, yeah, you can't even get to them on anything more specific, So why hit all the symptoms when you can't even get to the root? But I mean, I do agree, like no matter what, at the end of the day, education is key. And the fact that because they don't even want to, they might not know the specifics or the way it really truly affects and permeates into our livelihoods as a Black community, that would obviously also affect the different ways that we are affected and how we need certain laws and protections in place. And they might not understand that, like truly not understand that because they haven't gotten that far. But again, in the grander scale, if they at least agreed with the fact that things need to change, then they would come down and sit down and talk and have that conversation, but we can't even get there with a lot of them, That's more so what I was pointing towards.
Yeah.
So here's the question I would ask, and I hate to use these words, devil's advocate, but here's the question that I would ask. Let's say in a magical world, in the most perfect scenario, we get all people who quote unquote have this white privilege who might use it. When I say to their advantage, I mean to their advantage and to someone else's disadvantage, whether it be Black, white, Black, Asian, Hispanic. Even there's white privilege on white privilege, right? So let's say we get all of them in a perfect world to say, yes, we acknowledge this. We acknowledge that this is what we have been doing, or we not, use this in the best light. Then what? That's my question. Then what? We get them to acknowledge it, but then what are the steps that we are taking, or that we even can take, to say it's one thing to have acknowledgement, it's a whole nother thing to move into action, to course correct, to because you can't wipe out history. The history is going to be what it is. So it's acknowledgement, then it should go into action. But what does that look like?
Equity.
What'd you say?
Equity.
But can you expand on that though? When you say equity specifically, what do you mean?
Sure. Okay, I'll give you an example for Georgia.
Wait, real quick, I have a quick question. Sorry, in this hypothetical that we're building on, with everyone understanding, are they also the same accord that it should change, or is it just they're aware of it, period?
Yeah, well, I'm saying just aware in general, because I think and correct me if I'm wrong, I think kind of what we've been talking about is, hey, we just want to at least make them aware, right? Sit down and have the conversation. So let's say they all agree to sit down and have the conversation. I can have a conversation with you. So then what does the action step look like?
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Okay,
yeah.
So for an example, in Georgia, we have tons of studio productions that come through and take advantage of our tax credit, but our production sets aren't representative of the diversity that's in Georgia. You have damn near predominantly white productions that come here, and they don't take advantage of the production crew members of color. They don't take advantage of the vendors of color or above the line members of color. So they acknowledge their privilege. They come here. The next steps would be to open their productions to people who represent the demographic here in Atlanta. We are a predominantly Black city. Why are your sets almost all white? No, come here, open up your sets, embrace the creatives and the production crews and the vendors that are here that are eager to work on these upscale productions, high budget productions. We're here. Take advantage of that in a good way that will benefit our community. That's what I mean by taking actionable steps based on that knowledge of white privilege.
Are you looking more so like organically being included, or like through legislation? Because I'm thinking of again, like we talked about in other interviews, where there are programs where they look for diverse hires so that they can make it reflect the community that they're in. Or are you talking more so because again, when you say you want them to be aware and acknowledge and understand, that wouldn't necessarily change their action, So are we looking more so for people to just have that change of heart and organically include us, or to be aware, but then also rely on legislation to make bills and programs where we have to come in until it's a bit more leveled out and people organically down the line, which could happen, because I'm looking at the generation now and I'm hoping it kind of stays this way where people are being more aware of things. But the one we have right now, you can make someone aware, they might not necessarily care to make that change because this is what they're used to and this is what works for them. So, yeah.
No, it would be nice to be organic, but at this point, we're not waiting for that to happen. We're making legislative moves to ensure that we have an equitable stake in the productions that come through Georgia.
And I guess, you said that was my point. It's like we can make people aware of what's happening, but then what? The action steps. What do we do? Okay, you can, it'd be nice to have that organically happen, right? That may or may not be the case, but you see some things, some initiatives. A lot of these production companies take, diversity, inclusion, all that stuff, right? So you can wait for that. You can wait for the legislative. Don't hate me when I say this.
No
I
hate.
care, but listen, here's the thing, because I think a lot of times we focus so much on what is not happening, what our people are not getting, the opportunities that were not happening. And not to say that there shouldn't be any focus. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Not that there shouldn't be any focus. I feel like personally, we put so much focus over here about what's not happening that we can take some of that energy and effort, if not majority of it, and just start creating our own stuff. Start doing the Tyler Perry stuff. Start building it. Like, okay, cool, I'm gonna work on this. It's like having two plates spinning. But I feel like a lot of times our focus is, and I'm gonna just throw out some numbers. I feel like our focus might be 70% over here. Like, why won't they include us? They ain't. We ain't been getting included for years. So either
Since the birth of this country.
either I'm gonna continue to put my focus over here, or the majority of my focus, or how about I take a good majority of that energy and put it over here and start doing my Tyler Perry thing, start building my own studio, start building. I'm not waiting on nobody to, and I'm not saying that any of us are. I'm just saying, like, I have always been very much one of those type of people. I'm not giving nobody that much power. I'm just not. You don't have that much power over me to keep me out of an industry, to keep me off of a set. If you don't want me on your set, I don't want to be on your set. And that's white, black, Asian, whatever. Again, it's not about a race thing. It's like, I don't want to be where I'm not wanted. So instead of me focusing over here, let me just go over here and build my own empire, because that I have control over. That God, I know, will bless me with. I don't want to be a part of anything that is not rooted in genuine purity, period. And I know that might be completely absurd, but if your intentions are not pure, I don't want it no way. I don't. And I think for us, if we put more of our focus onto, again, not to take away from that, we don't acknowledge it, that it's not a problem, that it doesn't exist. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is if we could take most of that energy and just focus on our own stuff, I ain't got to worry about not being included in your stuff, period.
And I think the issue as to why that doesn't happen quite as much, I'll probably mention something, and I'm going to be fully honest, I'm not super well versed on Black Hollywood back in the day, like when it began, but I saw obviously Black Hollywood came out of not being included in white Hollywood. But I like to imagine that if this was something we truly, like as a full community, fully backed and supported continually since then, it could have grown to be on par with Hollywood. But then also I do look at history and look at the many times that the moment we try to do our own thing, they come in physically and try to, do their part.
It's
And
money.
I totally,
It's money.
it's money, but also,
fish and little fish.
well, I would also say not just money, it's well-being, because you brought up Black Hollywood before, not Black Hollywood, Black Wall Street. One of the times Black Wall Street was operating and doing better than I think regular Wall Street, they got bombed. That's a physical threat. And so I know there's like frustration on both ends, because I've always been of that same accord, Knajula. I agree, like we need to be an insurance amongst ourselves. I keep repeating myself, but I know that comes with a sacrifice, because going out on your own limb means it takes way more energy. It takes a much bigger sacrifice. So you can say, Tyler Perry, he worked for years, and I don't know what type of financial situation he had when he started, but that's, he's his own story. But at the same time, it might not always look that way. People like to give examples like Oprah, Tyler Perry, but you might not end up on that level. So you have to also be prepared to take what comes, or know that you're fighting for today for someone else's tomorrow, possibly, and that's something that people might not be okay with. And that's the thing I think that hurts us, not just in this topic of white privilege, but anything that we're trying to overcome. It's just seeing that people within the group that need to fight it have different levels of commitment and different levels of priorities, and just trying to, I think it's just important to know what that is for each person, because I do agree that we do need to not rely on other people, but we also have to be very honest and real about what that means for each person on their own, especially within the Black community. Like someone of affluence in the Black community can say, I'll do my own thing. But someone who's looking around for scraps, but still decides to come out to Hollywood, they will feel more compelled to be a part of this system that's already been set up, because it does pay more. And they might have to do things that they're not okay with. I'm not talking about horrible things, but certain types of roles. But I think it just comes down to what people are willing to sacrifice and what their priorities are. I want to believe that you can kind of straddle the fence, continually build this thing that may be good in our day and age, or may come to fruition down the line. But if you have to straddle and be a part of this, that's okay too. But don't expect them to come to your terms. Push back where you need to. I'm not saying just be there and just be happy to be there. No, that's never been my thing. Push back where you can. We do have rights in place, thank God, in this day and age. But understand that you're in someone else's, yeah, it is someone else's territory. It is what you said, the boys' club. It is the white man's club, sometimes the white woman's club. So I say either fixate on the people who respect you, which you can find white people who do that too. It's not just a Black thing. I say in general, just go to where you're respected. That might be a majority of people who look like you, but that could also be other people from other groups who've come out and realized there's more that they can get by just concentrating on people who are just focusing on the goal and not material things and not skin color and stupid things that we don't need to be measuring and like leaning towards.
But see, we have the power to create our own industry. Right now, you have 3 major multi-millionaire, damn near billionaires fighting for BET. Now, what if they were to combine their forces and create a bigger BET that could rival CBS or NBC or Fox? But no, they're competing against each other for one media entity. So that's why I'm saying, I'm 100% with you, Knajula. I am all the way. Let's build our own. But we're too busy infighting and trying to be the bigger person at the top of the hill to combine our resources together to create that enterprise. If we don't come together, then we're always going to be where we are. And we could have been in a much better place since we've been in this space since like the early 1900s. Oscar Michaud. Everybody should know who Oscar Michaud is.
Yeah.
But very few people in Hollywood do. Why is that?
Not educated on it. Not educated. And I think that this episode, again, is just to build awareness. Because when you have power, there's money, and then there's respect, right? So the Lena Waites, the Tyler Perrys, Byron Allen, and they said, you know what? We just gonna get our own, and we're gonna keep climbing. We're not gonna ask you. We're gonna keep climbing. We're gonna keep climbing. And that's when the white counterparts come in and it's like, hey, how you doing? At that point, you don't really care about white privilege. You don't care about what y'all did or what you're doing, because they had to be focused on where they needed to go. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah. I was just going to say, not to interrupt you, and just to kind of, even if I can kind of end on this point, I think what's even more important, and I think this is sometimes as a race, as a community, Black community, specifically within our community, is a lot of times we do focus on like, oh, it's the white privilege or the white man or this, that, and the third, right? Where that very well may be the case. I think a lot of times it's also a deflection about like what's going on within our own community. Just like she mentioned, instead of coming together and having a conglomerate, a bigger BET, if you would, we're so busy fighting amongst ourselves. Like we can't even be a collective to fight against anybody else if we're so divided amongst ourselves. And I think a lot of times we want to point the fingers out. And again, not to say that there's not any fault or anything, but a lot of times it's we have to look within our own community. What's going on in front of my face with my fellow sister, my fellow brother, before I even can go out and fight the world with what I know is already out there. But I need to acknowledge what's happening here, because we can't get around that. I can't go fight you about white privilege or racism or any of those things when you got the next Black man over here killing the other one on the, like, you see what I'm saying? Like we choose to put our energy and effort into things, not saying that there's not validity, but it also means that we got to be focused on our own front door, our own front porch, whatever the saying is, right? We have to make sure that we're not taking the light off of that, because that, if you ask me, is just as big of a concern as it is the white privilege or the racism or the prejudice. All of that stuff, we got our own to deal with. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is what the platform is all about. It's just building awareness. Hear our voices, but at the same day, we're going to pick up our bags and we're going to keep moving.
Absolutely. Agreed.
And just want to end on one major thing that I think we've all been agreeing on. The real key here is education. I mean, we say awareness, but it comes down to education because, you know, once you pass the collegiate stage, not everyone's trying to learn all over again. And those who are open to it, bless their souls, they usually do it anyway. So I won't say we've lost out on a generation. There's no hope. There is still hope. Like you mentioned, there's programs within workforces to make sure people are caught up to speed, or at least aware that there are going to be rules set in place, at least in this vicinity. But at the end of the day, the true change comes from the heart. So we have to look at the programs and the curriculum that are ushered into our elementary students, our middle school students, because that's when you're going to see the real change, where you don't have to tell someone to do it. Because if they're a good, decent person, it's going to be already in them anyway. And maybe you have to tweak things here and there where you go, oh, hey, just so you're aware, this is actually good or not good. And then they'll receive it and hopefully should change anyway, those little things here and there. But on the grand scale, they'll be aware, like we're asking for, and understand that this is something that needs to be reversed. So I think that should also be a huge place where we should place our efforts, is backing these, if there are any, and like I said, there's critical race theory, but if there are any other avenues that people are pushing to bring that into the educational system, so we can see that happen on the back end.
Absolutely.
Well, all right, we are going to wrap this up. We went over once again, but
always good.
The good conversations go overtime.
Great conversation. These are our last two for the season, and they've been amazing. Again, we're building awareness, education, and nourishment and empowerment. For those that are watching, there's no one against no other race, but there are issues out there that need to be talked about. But again, if you want to learn more knowledge about the television and film industry, find at your local library. If you're in high school or middle school, if you're in college, take some film classes up. Keep educating yourself on these things. So when you are a storyteller or a creative, you can speak on storytelling across the board, and it's not just directly on one thing. So we respect everyone. We thank you again, Knajula.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. I'm so appreciative. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. This is like, I felt like The View today. And it was you had
some girl.
Yeah, it was like a gumbo. You need these different ingredients to come up with solutions and talk about. So thank you again. Where can we find you at your socials?
Everything is going to be at Knajula. So Instagram, Facebook, at Knajula. That's, I know my mom was a quintessential Black mom. So let me spell it. It's Knajula at Knajula on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
And are there any projects you want to put out there, promote?
None that I can actually speak on right now. I will say that I have a couple of projects in development. I'm shopping a couple projects around right now, and hopefully you all will see them soon. But thank you. Thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. We are here to empower, uplift, and just back anyone. We're just here for support. We thank you so much, you guys. Thank you for sitting down and taking a sit with us on Slates and Koffee.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, ladies. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this first season of Slates and Koffee. It has been a wonderful journey. I hope everyone that watched was filled, nourished, educated, and empowered by these topics on film and television. We thank you so much for sitting down and taking a sip with us. Until next time.
Take a sip.